Hi everyone, and welcome back to Homecooked History. My name is Megan, and I am not a professional chef. I'm actually a professional historian, and this is not a professional kitchen or restaurant. This is my house. Homecooked History is the series where we try to recreate recipes from the past in today's casual kitchen. And today's recipe is a flavorful, culturally significant, vibrant dish that comes to us from the heart of the Deep South. Today we're going to be making shrimp gumbo. Today's recipe comes from the Southern Cookbook of Fine Old Dixie Recipes. This is a 1935 publication, although it's important to note that gumbo had been around for a lot longer, and also that it comes in a variety of forms. So even though we're doing one representation of gumbo today, that's not indicative of how dynamic and historical and deeply culturally embedded this dish is. So here is today's recipe, straight from the cookbook. You're going to need 2 quarts of raw deveined shrimp, peeled. You're also going to need some white vinegar. We're going to be using 6 fresh whole tomatoes, 3 white onions, 2 bay leaves. You're going to be using some parsley, some thyme for garnish and seasoning. We're going to be using a package of okra, an entire red bell pepper, some Worcestershire sauce, a little bit of butter, some salt, and rice. Brown or white is fine, whatever your preference. So even though there's a lot of variety with gumbo, there are a few distinct categories that we can kind of place these different recipes within. So for instance, in New Orleans cuisine, most households have 2 types of gumbo. So either seafood that's made with okra or an ingredient called filet, never both at the same time, or a chicken sausage gumbo combination. So those are kind of the 2 main camps of gumbo. The ingredients of gumbo also point to a really far-reaching global presence for this dish. So if we break down the ingredients, we can see the presence of a lot of different cultures in a lot of different places. For instance, the bay leaf supposedly was introduced to the area around the late 1720s, early 1730s by a group of Canadian nuns who came and planted the herb. We also see tomatoes, which is a New World delicacy that became the staple of many Americans' diets about the first half century of the 1800s or so. There's also Tabasco, which is a spicy sauce made in Louisiana from peppers. Andouille sausage is a popular ingredient of gumbo as well, not the version we're making today, but in other versions. And that is a pork sauce spice mixture that came from the Acadia region, actually, of Canada. And when those folks migrated down after they were expelled by the British, those peoples eventually became known as the Cajuns. So andouille sausage is a staple ingredient of a lot of different gumbo recipes. There's also shrimp, which comes from the Gulf of Mexico and features prominently in Louisiana cuisine, as does crayfish or crawfish, which is a freshwater cousin to the lobster, kind of. And then we've got rice, obviously, that comes from Asia and Africa. And then there are American versions of rice that are grown here after colonization, so that's a key part of gumbo. We see the presence of some French traditions in terms of the roux, which is this kind of butter flour mixture that is used to thicken the recipe. And then there's Indian filet, which is, again, this kind of thickener that flavors the broth. And so that's a native ingredient that appears in gumbo. And we can't forget the okra. The okra is really important because that's actually brought to the Americas by West African enslaved peoples and introduced into Louisiana cuisine. And that vegetable is referred to as King Gumbo, which is where the name gumbo actually gets its moniker. And then we've got peppers that come up from Mexico, particularly after Americans went down during the Mexican War. And so that flavor profile is going to come up and add a little spiciness to traditional gumbo recipes. So if we were to plot on a map where all of these things come from, it's literally a global effort to make gumbo. And we're going to see that representation in the flavors that we experience today. We are using a 1935 recipe for gumbo today, but there are plenty of other and earlier examples of gumbo recipes being published in cookbooks. For instance, in Lafcadio Hearn's 1885 cookbook, which is called La Cuisine Creole, the earliest Creole cookbook that we know of, gumbo was kind of referred to as this culinary wasteland, just a collection of leftovers of all kinds of meats, veggies, just whatever was available. So it didn't really refer to a particular standardized dish at that point. A little bit later in 1900, there was another cookbook that was referred to as the Picayune's Cookbook, published in 1900, and that did specify gumbo recipes, but there were at least 10 of them, ranging from the more traditional recipes that we're familiar with, like crab, shrimp, okra gumbo, to things that were more exotic, like shrimp gumbo, rabbit, cabbage gumbo, things like that. So even at that point, there was a lot of diversity, and that particular cookbook focused exclusively on New Orleans, so that wasn't even taking into account a lot of the diversity that existed in the region and throughout the South generally. So lots of adaptations had happened afterwards. So this 1935 gumbo recipe is a lot more specific than the earlier ones had been, and we kind of benefit from that as we go to the grocery store, but kind of an interesting thing to see how gumbo started really broad, really generic, and then eventually kind of went off on all of these little tangents into very distinct dishes. In addition to the other cookbooks that we've already discussed, there is another of note. The Creole Cookery book was published by the Christian Women's Exchange of New Orleans in 1885, and it actually referred to gumbo as an occult science that should be allowed its proper place in the gastronomical world. And that's a direct quote. And this cookbook refers to New Orleans gumbo as this combination of cold meat, fowl, maybe a few oysters, crabs or shrimp, as well as rice, and says that it was both a satisfying and economical dinner. So we see here how a lot of folks have appreciation for the flavor of gumbo, but there is kind of this accessible democratic quality to it because it could be made with ingredients that people had, and so it allowed people to kind of participate in the same food culture regardless of their class or economic situation. Start by slicing 2 onions. Now you're going to want to take your gumbo pot and put it on the stove. We're going to boil 2 quarts of water. Now add your 2 chopped onions and a pinch of salt to the water. Add half a cup of white vinegar at this point too. While you're waiting for your water to boil, go ahead and chop up your 3rd onion. Keep it together, Megan. Keep it together. Blood, sweat, and actual tears. As you can see, our water is boiling, so it's time to add the shrimp. Remember, that's 2 quarts of cleaned, peeled, and deveined shrimp, raw. So we're going to boil the shrimp until they become pink, but we're going to make sure that they're not overdone. It won't take long for the shrimp to finish, just a couple of minutes. Our next step is to boil our rice. So go ahead and get some water boiling on the stove, and we'll get that going in the background. So it's pretty much widely accepted that gumbo is served with rice. We see that in the traditional cookbook recipes of the past and also in how gumbo is served today. But apparently that wasn't always the case. For instance, in his travels throughout Louisiana between 1803 and 1805, C.C. Robin, a Frenchman, reported that the gumbo that he tried was actually served with cornmeal mush. So yet another example of the inconsistencies with gumbo. Throw 2 bay leaves into the pot. So while all of this is going, we are going to brown our 3rd onion in a tablespoon of butter in a separate pan. And while that's going, we're going to chop up our red pepper and our tomatoes. I'm going to add in a little bit of flour to the onions too, just to kind of give them a coating. Probably about a tablespoon of flour should do it for this, because the okra is actually the thickening agent, but I think it'll add a nice textural element to it. One of the ongoing controversies about gumbo is actually this French component called the roux. And the roux is a mixture of flour that's been cooked in some sort of fat, like butter. And it is used to thicken the gumbo, usually with filet or instead of filet. Again, okra is a separate approach to thickening, so they're not really used at the same time. But the thickness and the color of roux is a really controversial sticking point for a lot of folks with gumbo. So interesting that even the smallest detail is under scrutiny and under contestation with this recipe. Okay, let's chop up our red pepper and our tomato. We're going to dice them nice and small and consistent so that they go in with the onions and all the shapes are the same. Okay, so we have about a million things going right now, but we're going to take this brief downtime to clean and cut up our okra. Here you go, 1 quart of okra. It's really hard to pinpoint the origins of gumbo, and even the name is still a source of mystery. So the prevailing theory is that the dish is named after the West African word for okra, but a second and pretty viable theory is that the dish is actually named for a Choctaw word. So filet, the Native American ingredient, is actually made from sassafras leaves, and that is the thickener that goes in gumbo. But Native Americans, particularly the Choctaw, didn't refer to filet as filet. They called it either combo or gombo. So it is likely that there was some influence there with the naming of the dish, but just important to keep in mind that there's a lot of mystery about the origins of gumbo, the naming of it, and that a lot of these ingredients, because they came from other places, were referred to in different languages by different names. So just something to keep in mind as we move forward. So our water is boiling. I'm going to go ahead and add our rice. I am using bagged rice because I am lazy, but you can use all kinds of other rice. So now is the really exciting time where we put everything together in the big gumbo pot. I'm going to add our tomato, red pepper, onion mixture, and then eventually we'll add in the okra, and we'll get everything simmering and mixing in the same pot. Yum! It smells so good. Okay, We're going to add in a tablespoon of our Worcestershire sauce into the big pot, and then our garnishes, so just a little bit of parsley and a little bit of thyme. Once your rice is fully cooked, you're going to add that into the pot too, and then we're going to simmer everything together so it melts all of the flavors. Okay, so everything's in the pot. We're going to let it mellow and meld and combine for a few minutes just on a simmer, and that should be everything. If you do want to add some additional flavors like Tabasco, for instance, or maybe some Cajun seasoning, that's totally appropriate. It just depends on your heat level. It's not in this recipe, but I am sure that it is in another gumbo recipe somewhere. So a lot of the times when we discuss gumbo and other New Orleans dishes or Louisiana dishes, the term Creole comes up a lot. I think it's important to define what exactly that term refers to and where it came from. So originally the term Creole, it was derived from a Portuguese word called Creole, which referred to specifically enslaved peoples of African descent who were born in the New World. But later that definition was expanded to refer to people of European descent that were born in the New World as well, such as the French and the Spanish. And after the territory became part of the United States, the word Creole was used loosely to refer to people of all ethnicities, except really for Native Americans who were, quote, native to Louisiana, especially French-speaking New Orleanians who were of European descent and free people of color. So important to recognize that Creole is an important term in terms of historical Louisiana cuisine, but also that it changed over time. Sometimes folks confuse or conflate Cajun with Creole, but those are very distinct terms that mean different things. So Cajun actually is a word that has somewhat been corrupted, but it referred to Acadian, or the French name for present-day Nova Scotia. And the British actually expelled those French speakers in 1755, and in the mid-1780s, several thousand Cajuns actually settled in the bayous of New Orleans and in the surrounding community. The community eventually grew to be a predominant cultural ethnic group in that area, and really altered gumbo by changing the spice level, the seasoning, and creating kind of this hearty version. So there is a Cajun influence to gumbo, but it is distinct from, although occasionally overlapping with, the Creole influence. Okay everybody, it's been a few minutes, so let's check on our gumbo and see if it's ready.
Oh yeah, that smells awesome.
Okay, let's get some of this in the bowl and see how it tastes. So as you guys can see, it is a awesome mix. I mean, it smells so good. I wish that you could smell it. It's thinner than I would have thought, than I've seen a lot of gumbos turn out. So I'm wondering if that's maybe where the roux would come into play, or if a different preparation, the okra, would really help. But I'm curious to see what the flavors are like. So let's get in there. Oh yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's really good. It's hot. It's really hot. But it's so tasty. It's got this great seasoning to it. But you can really taste the tomatoes and the onions. I think it probably needs a little more rice. It's not as viscous as I was thinking maybe the gumbo broth would be. But in terms of flavor, yeah, this is really, really good. Well, as we've seen today, when it comes to taste and spice and flavor, you're just not going to beat New Orleans cuisine. This gumbo recipe was delicious. I would highly recommend. If you all make it at home, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you at the next Home Cooked History. And remember, past or present, everybody's got to eat. Thanks, everyone. Oprah, I hardly know her. Sorry. Whoa! Thunder. Here, let me get your testimony. How was the gumbo for you?
It was delicious. Very tasty.
It was so good I had to come back for more. Very good gumbo.